Welcome, everybody, to Democrats Abroad, Environment and Climate Crisis Council's September Climate Cafe. I am Dana Freeling, the chair of the ECCC. I am a Texas voter, and I'm calling in from my home in Finland. We are emerging from a summer where wildfires have devastated Maui. Smoke from Canada has choked U.S. cities. Florida waters hit 100 degrees, blanching coral reefs. Libya has just seen over 10,000 dead from flooding. And hurricane season has hardly begun. We are in a climate emergency, which must be recognized as such. If you have not signed DA's petition to Biden to declare climate an emergency, Angela will be posting that in our chat. Please do take that opportunity now. Anyway, thank you for joining our Climate Cafe this month, where we welcome Dr. Graham Prescott to help discuss if the private sector can be a force for good in biodiversity conservation. Unfortunately, the private sector is a significant driver of biodiversity loss. But businesses are becoming increasingly aware of the economic risks of biodiversity loss and the opportunities associated with biodiversity conservation. We are so looking forward to hearing from Graham on how voluntary initiatives are shaping corporate behavior. Graham Prescott is Research and Development Lead at the Biodiversity Consultancy in Cambridge, United Kingdom, with a focus on helping clients understand and use biodiversity data and metrics to align with the requirements set out by the Science Based Targets Network and Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. An interdisciplinary conservation scientist, Graham has over 10 years' experience solving applied research problems with industry, academic, NGO, and government partners. He has expertise in measuring and understanding biodiversity and has carried out multi-taxon surveys and large-scale field experiments in forest and palm oil landscapes in Borneo and Colombia to test strategies for sustainable palm oil production. Graham strongly believes that effective conservation has to tackle the root causes of biodiversity loss. He has investigated the political and economic context of deforestation and informal gold mining in Myanmar and managed an international project investigating the role of conserving mountain biodiversity in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals in Bolivia, Nepal, and Tanzania. Graham was born in the US, but raised in the UK and is a valued member of the Democrats Abroad family. He recently moved back to Cambridge, England from Switzerland, where he was an active DA volunteer. Thank you so much for joining us, Graham. The floor is yours. We can't wait to hear what you have to teach us about.
Oh, thanks, Dana. That's a really nice introduction. Let me share my screen. All right, I think all good on screen sharing. You can see me, shout if you can't. So yeah, I think, and yeah, very happy to be here. And yeah, enjoyed being involved with DA in Switzerland when I lived there. And yeah, very happy to be presenting here. And yeah, I'm a rare Alaska voter, which is always fun once in a while. In the right times, it makes a difference. So yeah, I think, and yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about a few topics in the involvement of the private sector in conservation. This private sector is both simultaneously one of the biggest drivers of the nature crisis, but also has, as a result, has a very big opportunity to turn it around. And so yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my journey from academia into this and kind of why I did this, but also yeah, just talk about some of the major issues shaping private sector involvement in conservation, some of the hot topics right now. I realize this is a climate-centered one. This is a climate-centered discussion group, and this is kind of a slightly different nature topic on biodiversity. Kind of happy to, and I've tried to keep it relatively short so that we can have lots of time for questions, and feel free to ask anything that's not about this presentation. Happy to do a bit of an AMA about biodiversity conservation at the end of this. So yeah, just start obviously with why we care. So we are losing some of the most kind of interesting and beautiful parts of the fabric of life on Earth. So this is it's one of many American bird species that has gone extinct over the last few hundred years. This is Kawi I don't know if you can hear it. So this is something that's gone extinct so it's one of the last recordings before it went extinct in 1987 in Hawaii, on the island of Kauai. So we have a lot of species that, due to human activities, will never be seen again. And this has consequences not just because it's nice to look at, or not because it's deprived us of nice bird watching opportunities, but because when we tear at the threads of the fabric of life on Earth, we may unravel ecological functioning and everything we depend upon. So the big picture is obviously, we talk a lot about the way humans are changing the atmosphere, but I think I liked this diagram from XKCD, which 1 square is 1 million tons, and it just shows the sheer weight of animals on Earth, or land mammals on Earth. And you can see the big thing in the middle, and you can see this is a nice illustration of how humans have totally dominated the biosphere. So in the middle is the combined weight of all humans. In lighter gray is the combined weight of every animal we've domesticated, and the little green blocks are everything that's left over. So humans have totally transformed the shape of life on Earth. This is the Living Planet Index, which is an aggregate of some primary populations of wild animals. It's not super representative. It's very Europe and North America focused, but these are trends we see around the world. So we've been kind of declining. A lot of good records start in 1970s, and we know that we want to ultimately bend the curve of biodiversity loss. And we've done a lot, there's a lot of collective modeling, collective understanding to show that obviously if we continue business as usual, we're going to see a steady decline of life on Earth towards, and potentially even a mass extinction event comparable to the ones that we saw at the end of the Cretaceous or at the end of the Permian. But we know that we can kind of hold this by doing better at conservation, and that we can turn this around by combining better conservation with more sustainable production, more sustainable consumption. And obviously, as being kind of underpinning sort of human behavior and human financial transactions, the kind of global economy is obviously a key part of this. And I'm not going to talk too much about transforming the global economy. We can sort of get into that at the end, but this is kind of, if we want to increase sustainable production, then we need to talk to the private sector. Very briefly on how I got here, I'd say I was radicalized by zoo books as a child. So got to spend some time in rainforests. I spent part of my childhood in Colombia, and sort of deforestation sort of inspired me to eventually do a zoology degree, which took me to the forests of Borneo, which are being turned into palm oil plantations. So I wanted to understand how we can find better ways to make palm, sort of both halt the expansion of palm oil into tropical forests, but also understand if we can manage palm oil plantations themselves a bit better. This sounds glamorous, but involved sort of 12 hours a day at a microscope analyzing ants. So each of these samples would contain potentially hundreds of ants that I was sort of sorting out to do this, because ants are a very good proxy of biodiversity and ecological function in general. So that's kind of what a PhD in ecology actually entails doing. But that's, I kind of got to the end of this, felt like I was giving companies recommendations, or not even giving companies recommendations, just putting out recommendations into the academic literature about, well, clearly we can maintain ant biodiversity if we change management practices. But then, I got to the end of it, I thought, well, okay, this is great advice, it's scientifically based, but we're not limited by knowledge on biodiversity. We need to really understand kind of who's making these decisions and why. So this took me to a postdoc in Myanmar, where it's kind of understand, I'm not going to go, not expecting you to get into the details of this. But, we understand that, fundamentally, if you want to, once you start digging into details of saying, okay, what are the big things driving biodiversity laws? Okay, they're mining, logging, hydro, agriculture. But then where's that coming from? Okay, these are land concessions given out by the government. They're basically collecting a lot of foreign and domestic investment. That's all related to the easing of sanctions after democratic reform, and all embedded in the context of 60 years of civil war. So it kind of became more of a geographer and became more interested in understanding the big picture context of this, and applied that to gold mining landscapes. And I think what I found most satisfying in my research career was being able to go to Myanmar government officials and ask them, okay, what problems do you actually care about? Not what if you, because they're not reading the scientific literature, they're not reading papers, they're making decisions. And so it's nice to actually go to decision makers and say, okay, what's your biggest problem? And his was understanding illegal gold mining. So we did some research understanding how you can actually tackle that. So I think it was that experience of being like, okay, so I want to solve real problems, and I want to ask people who care about it, and yeah, try to give pragmatic answers to do that. So that sort of led me to a sort of research position I hold now within a consultancy, that I can talk more about. That's like, we talk basically what the private sector needs to do, and so this is, if we know the current state of biodiversity, we know that it's going down. So we know that if businesses go as usual, and, and something I should say at the beginning, I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer here. These are sort of personal opinions, but I will borrow some graphs from work I've done there. So this is from some work we've done on biodiversity credits. So if you actually go, what we tell companies to do is you have to first kind of avoid your impact. So in the mining context, if you think of that kind of big mine, obviously it's kind of avoid mining in the worst areas, kind of minimize the land footprint, minimize the use of any pollutants if you can't avoid them, restore everything afterwards, do some ecological compensation. And, so that's the kind of what we call the mitigation hierarchy. So you can go through and tell any company in any sector how it can do this to basically minimize negative. But something that's been kind of nice to see in the private sector is there's an increasing interest in being nature positive. So in being kind of going beyond not just avoiding things, but in actually making positive contributions to address some of the damage that's been done in the past. So we know that we need to do all these things and more. So some of my colleagues, like Holly Booth, have done some really good work on like what principles you actually need. So it needs to be ambitious, it needs to be aligned with global targets. You need to, so it's a lot of the work that I do is going through and saying, because companies will often have a desire to do something, but obviously they need a structured framework in which to do that, and make sure it's backed by evidence and the targets are appropriate, and that social justice is also considered in any intervention. And this is a paper that my colleagues in I have recently published to say, okay, this is, within the context of global biodiversity goals, what do we need to do basically? So we need to understand, obviously, the systematic drivers. So we need to understand what's actually causing biodiversity loss. So, it's looking at financial market, looking at social pressures, looking at governance, looking at regulation. And trying to understand what strategic options exist for companies. So a lot of that is, a lot of the work I do is understanding and quantifying impact. So get a list of commodities that company buys or produces, and then going through, okay, how do you turn that into a score of biodiversity impact? And then how do you set targets to reduce the negatives and increase the positives? How do you implement that? And then how do you find out whether it's actually working or not? And so there's kind of a circle there, and you're ideally steering companies towards reducing negative impacts and increasing positive impacts. So sort of the conceptual model of what I'm trying to do with the private sector, what my company is trying to do with the private sector, and where the best companies are engaging. Can talk about at the end. Obviously, the tricky bit is really the drivers. so that's always the kind of fly in the ointment is this stuff is all good, but ultimately, do you really need to tackle drivers? Can talk about that at the end. We'll talk a little bit about why companies are doing this. So why would a company actually go through the effort of trying to understand biodiversity? And this is something we found quite interesting because when I got started in sort of ecology and biodiversity research, it was, I mean, motivated. I was personally motivated by the fact that it's very important and kind of interesting and enjoyable to me, but it wasn't really on social, it wasn't kind of mainstream and social agenda. It was seen as quite a niche issue. So it's kind of recently that it's kind of exploding as an issue, and it's kind of following the footsteps of climate. So what we're seeing is a lot of companies have started a journey on becoming more, towards net positive for climate, or towards at least, or towards meeting global targets, and are now thinking, oh, okay, what about everything else in biodiversity? So and don't worry about the details in the table, but basically it's mainly driven by risk. So I would say at the moment, my take is that a lot of it, I mean, so some of the actors, obviously, you will get organizations that are really interested in biodiversity for its own sake, but so you get some sort of leading edge companies that will want to do the right thing because an owner or because employees in it really want to do something good. The way we're getting kind of the middle or the sort of reluctant middle is by talking about risk. So obviously help companies increasingly understand that there are sort of physical risks to their supply chain. So if you're an agricultural company that depends on pollinated crops, then biodiversity loss or ecological collapse really, we've got here loss of regulating services can really impact what they're actually selling. If you're a timber company dependent on tropical timber and it's not managed sustainably, then there is a physical risk to companies' profits. Transition risks, which is basically fear of looking bad or fear of getting caught out by legal changes. So we'll talk a little bit about, so this is maybe the regulation is probably most advanced in the EU. And this is really just about worry that as consumers and as regulators become more conscious of the need to protect the environment, there is a risk that a company will be kind of caught out in that transition. And there are sort of systemic collapses, so beyond a certain threshold of deforestation, the whole biome might collapse. So there's a big risk that if we go over a tipping point of potentially 4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial warming, that the entire Amazon rainforest basin could kind of collapse as a sort of rainforest system and turn into a kind of dry, fire-prone grassland system, which would be really catastrophic, not just to biodiversity, but to a lot of the economic activities that occur there. So it's kind of the risk. I mean, and this is all in terms of where, and kind of focus a bit more on the regulation side, just because that's I think one of the biggest drivers of companies changing, and sort of where the context I've worked in has been primarily EU context. So I'm not so familiar with the US regulatory context. And my understanding is that the US regulatory context is not as proactive on biodiversity yet as the EU one. So that could be an interesting discussion point. It's all framed around the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So all the countries in the world, or almost all the countries in the world, got together and agreed on a set of ambitious targets to stop species going extinct, to help companies, and they acknowledged a role for the private sector in that. But obviously, it's for everyone. It's for governments. It's for civil society to mobilize together and help protect what biodiversity we have left and to restore areas where biodiversity has been lost. So the EU is going to require companies to go through a lot of paperwork on sustainability reporting if they operate there. So this is kind of at the moment large EU-based and EU-listed companies. In the future, this might also include, companies that operate in the EU as well. So this is one way to have sort of global influence. But this is going to be effectively, a set of regulations on how companies need to understand and disclose their potential impacts on the environment. So this is something that is not operational yet, but will be coming up in the horizon. So we expect EU regulation to have a big influence on corporate behavior. It's also the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. It's a bit of a mouthful. That came out this week, so it's very relevant, and happy to talk about that because I was involved in developing some of their guidance documents. So the theory of change, and the theory of change before for the EU regulation is that, well, if you want companies to do something, you have to force them to. The theory of change of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures is that if you encourage companies to disclose their risks, disclose their opportunities, disclose their impacts to the market, that market will use that as a signal. The market will respond and reward good actors, punish bad actors. So this is, and this has been critiqued, and happy to discuss the critiques as well. So I think there is a feeling that, and so this is something that we're seeing a lot of excitement about, and should be quite influential. It's building on the work of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And, as with many things, it's, climate has gone first and biodiversity is catching up. But this is something that, there's a large set of guidance documents on how companies, on where companies should disclose disclose nature-related issues, whether it's about governance, their strategy, the risks and impacts, what metrics and targets they're using, and and there's particular guidance on reporting around where they operate in low integrity ecosystems, high importance ecosystems, and areas of water stress. So we've had regulations, we've had voluntary initiatives. Another voluntary initiatives is the Science Based Targets Network, and this is and a lot of kind of companies who are very serious about nature-related impacts are kind of heavily involved in this. And this is a stepwise process for companies to really understand, assess and prioritize where they're having impacts on natures and set targets so that they can act on them. And so this is asking quite ambitious things, actually. So it's asking companies with large agricultural footprints to set a target to completely avoid any further conversion of natural habitats and to actually reduce the area that they operate on. So it's really asking companies to, because a lot of big name brand food companies, if you go through and analyze their total land use footprint, it's often equivalent to that of a small country. So to actually getting companies to commit to reducing how much land they occupy so that more land is available for natural habitat is actually huge if it can happen. And there are also a lot of targets on reducing water pollution, which is a major driver of aquatic biodiversity loss. And then a very topical one that's coming up right now is biodiversity credits. Obviously, carbon credits has been in the news a lot this year, and it's been very controversial. So biodiversity credits will also be controversial and potentially influential, but this is one of the things I see the most chat and excitement about. Field, I mean, this is just a small map of all the players that are interested in biodiversity credits. So you have it's people kind of developing and technical assistance, giving advice. People are sort of setting up programs for verifying biodiversity credits. So it's a very complicated field. This is one that's been published recently, Vera Nature Credit Framework. So, they're providing, the idea is that anyone who's able to conserve an area of land over and above and prove that the biodiversity gain is better than what would have happened otherwise, will be eligible for credits that can be sold on the market. So yeah, so this is things where, you basically, if you wanted to, let's say you take an area of forest where there's been a lot of hunting, if you're able to kind of come in and work with communities, reduce the amount of hunting, then you can demonstrate that, okay, if you had done nothing, then kind of following the red line, there would have been loss of biodiversity, but because of the intervention, you actually saw an increase in the types of species, number of species, populations of species that you care about. Then you can demonstrate, if you can demonstrate a credible biodiversity outcome from a conservation intervention, then you're eligible for credit financing. And this is both extremely exciting and extremely scary. So this is really exciting because we know that biodiversity conservation needs more funding. We know kind of how conservation works. We know, that's the question, but fundamentally we know how to do conservation, but we don't have the funding for it. Private sector has a lot of interest in averting nature-related collapse because it ultimately depends on the services provided by nature. So in some ways, there's kind of an obvious kind of opportunity to help fill the financial gap from those who can pay. And obviously, it depends how you feel about profiting from nature. Obviously, there's lots of philosophical discussions about general framework of these decisions. But within the sort of global capitalist economy that we have, money is what shifts decisions on the ground. And so you often speak to, if you speak to people in countries like Malaysia, where I am today, or like Brazil, they'll say, hey, you in North America, Europe, you're at us for deforestation, but you're not willing to pay for it. You benefit from global rainforest conservation, but no one's giving us money for it. It's more profitable to turn the rainforest into palm oil or cattle pasture or soy. So this is potentially a way to make biodiversity worth conserving, worth keeping within our global capitalist society. Obviously, there are big risks. So the risks of, if you get the numbers wrong, the risks that, okay, maybe if you make it harder to convert rainforest, let's say, in one area, then you might inadvertently shift the deforestation to another. So that's a big risk. Another big risk, and this is kind of where carbon credits got into the biggest trouble. It was not over the risk of shifting, but it's the risk of if you're not totally there's obviously a lot of error around the estimate of biodiversity outcomes because it's so complicated. And I mean, there's error around the estimate of carbon outcomes, especially when you're comparing to what would have happened otherwise. So it's difficult to, it's not so difficult to demonstrate an impact, but it's difficult to very precisely demonstrate that impact. And where the biggest risk, and these are risks that everyone developing the biodiversity credit frameworks is hopefully thinking about. So these are not unsolvable problems. But the biggest risk is that, if companies use these as what we call offsets. So if a company uses it to say, hey, look, I've bought 10 units of I know that our activities cause 10 units of biodiversity loss, but don't worry, I've bought credits equivalent to 10 units of biodiversity gain, therefore I'm good. We're good, we're biodiversity neutral. Then the big risk is that will, obviously the big risk is that any error in the, if they've underestimated the negative impacts, or if they've overstated the positive impacts of their actions, then the numbers aren't going to add up. And then the claim about being biodiversity neutral and the whole system is going to be called into question. And this is why, this is kind of what went wrong with carbon credits. It's mainly, and when there have been kind of critiques of it, it's partly a technical discussion about underestimating the amount of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gas emissions reductions, or technical contention over those claims. But it's fundamentally about whether companies can and should declare themselves carbon neutral using those credits. So I think I see that as the biggest risk, but this is sort of the biggest yeah, this is kind of one of the biggest changes we're seeing, in that biodiversity conservation in the private sector was seen as first as we don't care for the most part, or we'll care if there's a very specific reason to a general, okay, we need to care because we don't want people in orangutan costumes protesting outside our company headquarters over the use of palm oil, now we need to comply with EU regulations, hang on, we can make some money out of biodiversity conservation. And yeah, that's kind of that's probably the most interesting philosophical shift that's happening. Obviously, we're still some years from seeing voluntary credit markets, and it seems to be a very high risk, high reward area, and one that will need a lot of care. And then kind of wrapping up, yeah, so obviously we need to, we can talk about good company action. So you need to tackle drivers, you need to tackle the root causes of biodiversity loss. So that's fundamentally, I've put that really simply, but it's really complicated. So decouple well-being improvements from fiscal impacts on nature. So like our measures of well-being increase have been, are we using and buying more stuff? And as long as that continues to be true, as long as we continue to think of ourselves as happy because we buy and use more stuff, it's very hard to improve well-being for everyone in the world without putting bigger pressure on nature. I'm going to give a shout out to a podcast that a friend of mine runs called Economics for Rebels. I know nothing about basically nothing about economics as a field, very surface level. So I've talked about the sort of conservation, how business activities impact conservation, but in terms of what the option space is for restructuring global economy, economic theory, kind of point you in this direction. Or should give you some interesting ideas. Companies have, in my opinion, companies are primarily coming to this in terms of risks. So it's kind of, are we in trouble if our supply chain is messed up because we damaged biodiversity? Are we in trouble if we get a bad reputation because consumer preferences transition? Are we in trouble if natural ecosystems systematically collapse? Increasingly, they're seeing it as opportunities to profit from nature conservation. And then, lots of encouraging voluntary initiatives, but obviously it helps if they're supported by public regulation. So it helps if a public regulator says, okay, you're only allowed to be listed on the stock market if you've disclosed on your nature impacts, which is kind of, maybe what will happen with TNFD, let's see. And obviously, consumer behavior really matters. Voter behavior matters a lot. And I think credits seem to be the biggest sort of opportunity and risk area emerging at the moment. Sorry, that was a very sort of brief tour of some topics that I'm interested in. And I hope that was clarifying, and let me know if you would love to hear any questions.
Unmute. Thank you so much. Graham, that was fascinating. I have so many questions, and I'm sure other people do too. Please put your star hand up in the chat, or just raise your hand if you want to be recognized for a question. Maybe I'll get started. I'm wondering what of the many queries that I have, 30 by 30, palm oil, I don't know. Let's see if other people cover some of these. But palm oil and palm plantations are the most notorious. It's interesting that you decided to study that and how we could somehow mitigate those effects. Could you share a little bit more about what you see in terms of prospects going forward with the production of palm oil and conserving land and the worldwide addiction to this ingredient, because it does seem to appear everywhere?
Yes, definitely. So it's a huge issue. I mean, I got into it just because I was kind of interested in ecology of the Southeast Asian rainforest, and that was, that is the dominant trend. And if you drive anywhere between cities in Malaysia or Borneo, it's palm oil, palm oil, palm oil. And I've spoken to Indonesians and Malaysians, and some have called it the money tree. And some have said like, oh, it is just, at the moment, it is the best way to get money in a tropical rainforest area. And I had a very critical discussion with someone on a bus in Malaysia who told me, sometimes I think, British people want us to be poor so that they can have nice holidays in the rainforest. And that's a very good critical question. And that's why ensuring that there's funding for rainforest conservation as an alternative to palm oil or any other cash crop is very important, if we're being kind of pragmatic and kind of fair in a sort of global equity perspective as well. I think it's important to see it as not just palm oil specific, but just general cash crops, general agriculture, general conversion of that. So there's the issue of, obviously, if you switch away from palm oil but go to soybean oil, like you've just shifted the problem somewhere else, so that doesn't address it. So partly sort of needing to address global food demand, which can be, and obviously that comes into things about how much food we waste and so on, but also coming into also making sure stemming the demand for biofuels, because that could actually create huge incentive to increase the amount of land under palm oil or other crops. Maybe intensifying existing production, making sure it doesn't replace rainforest, making sure it replaces, cattle pasture. It could replace cattle pasture instead of rainforest, something we found in Colombia. So lots of options, but you have to make rainforest conservation or natural habitat conservation worthwhile, and that's a really big challenge.
Big challenge. I see Bruce has his hand up with the first question. Bruce.
Graham, thank you very much for that very rich presentation and for starting it with an image of Ranger Rick. He came to our house about 25 years ago, and I hadn't thought about him too much recently. Soon after that slide, you had a slide with scenarios out to 2050. And once in a while, you used the word scarier. And I'm a little bit frightened, because I think in order to get to 2050, we have to do some really big things by 2030. Yes. And that takes me to the slide where you list the drivers. And I'm calling that Al Gore says we have to focus on business leaders and policymakers. And here comes the question. If we're trying to win to get to the goals that the Paris Agreement has set for 2030, maybe focusing on business leaders and policymakers, if you, and this is kind of challenging, condensed all of what you presented to us into a kind of recipe for winning by 2030, would you be willing to tackle that and give us some insight?
That's such a good question. What I would tell, I think the secret to winning, I think it is, it's somehow about internalizing the costs of this. So I mean the fundamental issue is that the costs of if you can benefit from environmental destruction now, you typically don't pay the costs. So that somehow really getting it into the pricing of things, into the pricing, not just the monetary pricing, but also into people's behavior of, these costs are, these long-term trends are that, but also seeing it as the sort of benefit. So sorry, that's a very weak answer. I've not eloquently presented that, but it's something about, it has to be about making it more worthwhile to people in the short term to do the right thing for the long term. And we need to speak to smart economists, philosophers, psychologists, marketers on how to effectively do that. And I mean, it's something that's quite challenging when you come at it from a biodiversity nerd perspective. Like, obviously the rainforest is amazing and we need to do this, but people will very rationally say, well, you like it. I don't like the mosquitoes. I find it kind of sweaty there. So, how to really internalize that value so that, the government, and the people we need to win over are not, us in the Zoom room. It's, it's like the president of Brazil, and his, internal critics. So it's, something about making those costs feel real and those benefits feel real in the short term.
I think we did win over the president of Brazil.
We
Or at
did,
least
yeah. So we changed the
Brazil
position.
won
Yes.
a new president. Yes. Does that satisfy your answer, Bruce?
If I could venture just a quick follow-up, I like the SBTN or SBT initiative. I just looked while you were speaking, and they're up to about 3,500 companies now who are participating. And the last time I looked, it was in the 2,000 range. So, and I know that the WWF is a big player there. Can you say anything more, maybe pumping us up about that being something that shows some promise for trying to shift from that orientation from short-term gain to long-term gain?
Yes, I think it is. It is very encouraging that a lot of leading brand companies, and I've been involved in some of the SBTN development as well. So it is, seeing it from the inside as well. It is very promising to see a lot of, it's seen as desirable for a lot of big companies to be committing to these public actions, committing to these public targets. Obviously, the realist in me wants to see them actually do the work. Let's see until they've actually set the targets and done it, because they are going to be very difficult. But it's really encouraging that a lot of big company brands, and I don't know if I can say them publicly, maybe they're publicly online. It's really encouraging that a lot of big public company brands have committed to doing that. So it does show. I mean, the fact that also maybe one slightly weird take is we're seeing more kind of, for want of a better word, tools and opportunists and kind of slightly dodgy people getting into conservation, which is a worry, but is also kind of encouraging to see. It's a sign of the fact that the fact that people are seeing it as desirable to be acting on biodiversity, or desirable to publicly have a statement on biodiversity, is a positive sign. Obviously, we need to make sure that's a real commitment and real action, but it's nice that it's at least desirable to signal action towards that. It's a step in the right direction, and that is not seen as totally something to be totally ignored. So positive, even in a very pessimistic case, that's very positive. And in an optimistic case, I mean, if they actually go through and set those targets, it'll be really transformative.
Interesting. I see Eric has been waiting patiently to ask you a question.
Yeah, first, thank you, Dana, so much for setting this up, and nice to see you again, Graham. My palms are sweaty because I have so many questions. I'm trying to figure out which one to start with. Here, let me post something in the chat. Recently, there was an article published about this happens every couple of years or so, as it's an updated article on planetary boundaries and how far we are from sustainable levels in many different areas, aside from just climate change and aside from just biodiversity. But on the question of biodiversity, and I know you defined it a little bit in the presentation, maybe I'll start here. What defines healthy biodiversity? It seems as if you boiled it down to genetic diversity. Is it just genetic diversity? I guess the answer is no. And then also one aspect of that, and sorry, I'll shut up in a second. One aspect of that also is, especially when it comes to setting targets for companies to set, then, for instance, what would it mean to restore biodiversity where biodiversity / natural ecosystem hasn't really existed for hundreds of years? Take Central Europe, for instance. Yeah,
really deep philosophical questions, which I like. So I think the biodiversity, I think something that's really challenging in talking and communicating about biodiversity is that it doesn't naturally have standardized units in the way that equivalents of greenhouse gas emissions do. So, I mean, it is literally the richness of life in all its forms, and can be defined in ecosystem level diversity, species level diversity, genetic level diversity. So that's in the sort of fundamental guidelines. I like to think of diversity as different ways of doing the same thing, or different ways. So it's different ways of living, different ways of doing that. So it's kind of different solutions to the problem of how to live. And I think why it's important is, because when an ecosystem is composed of different ways of performing the same functions, it tends to be more resilient to change, and it tends to have, better outcomes for all. So that's kind of what I see as like the point, the why of it. And then a kind of interesting issue is, in practice, the way the quality of biodiversity is defined is often as for the things that are measured. So for the species that are measured, if it's populations of mammals, birds, insects, or if it's the size of trees, the height of trees, for whatever aspect you're measuring, it's kind of what fraction of it are you versus the ideal state. How do you define the ideal state? Excellent question. So how do you define the ideal state? Is sometimes people set a baseline at some time in the past, like 1970 or 1900, or what we estimate to have been there 5,000, 50,000 years ago. That's obviously really challenging and contentious. It's always going to be a bit arbitrary where you set your baseline, but it does have important consequences. So, and I think it does have the fact that people often use a set historical baseline does have an interesting knock-on effect, in that it means the targets for Northern Europe are much less ambitious than the targets for Central Africa. So people have dug in and said, okay, what was Europe like pre-human arrival or pre-large-scale agriculture? So that can be done. There's a nice Science or Nature paper maybe 20 years ago saying, okay, what was America like 20,000 years ago? Okay, well, it had mammoths, it had saber-toothed tigers, it had smilodon, so actually, if we really want to create a baseline native North American ecosystem, we should bring in proxies. The mammoths don't exist, but we can introduce elephants, we can introduce lions, we can introduce cheetahs, and that's actually what we should be restoring to. So at that level, it becomes preference. But there are, what makes this challenging is there are a lot of, within the biodiversity conservation communities, there are a lot of different valid, reasonable people can disagree definitions of what we're aiming towards.
I heard today that they have just extracted the RNA of a Tasmanian tiger,
cool.
Which would indicate that they might be able to actually ultimately bring back extinct species.
Yes.
Wondering how that could fit into the equation.
So I'd say most conservationists would say, yes, that would be a really cool project. And yeah, as Eric said, a viable one would be, so closest relative of the woolly mammoth is the Asian elephant. And so a talk by someone called Beth Shapiro, who said, like, look, if you look at it, it could in theory be possible to kind of combine woolly mammoth and get sort of woolly mammoth DNA, create an embryo, kind of implant it in the womb of an Asian elephant, and birth a woolly mammoth, and maybe we could genetically modify a Asian elephant, give it kind of furry red hair, cold tolerance genes, and so on. So it's maybe within the realms of possibility. I think with thousands of species going extinct, it's going to be more cost effective to stop things going extinct than to bring them back. And there's also the issue of, well, I mean, obviously it'd be fun, it'd be interesting, but it's going to be a distraction project rather than a real solution. But I have been to talks by serious ecologists where they say, well, the Siberian ecosystem has never really recovered from losing mammoths, so we need to bring them back and kind of transform that landscape. But there's also one big question that the conservation community hasn't really grappled with, in my opinion, and there's a good book called Inheritors of the Earth, is a very good, I'm going to put it in the chat actually, if it's one book to read. It's one that I found very interesting. It's that actually, if our goal is to restore to, let's say, 1900 or 1800, then, what do we do in a changing climate? Because it's not, if things lived well in Florida in 1900, Florida in 2050 is very different from Florida in 1900, so maybe it's not appropriate. So, I mean, so you can define it. I mean, the two philosophies are either to define it in terms of what it was at a certain point in the past, or to define it in terms of, okay, what's resilient functional ecosystem? Sorry, that was a long answer to a simple question.
No, but actually, I'm sure we have so many. I'm not sure whether Eric was finished, but I know that Wenwen has been waiting in the chat, and then we can come back to Eric and some other questions that we're probably all eager to ask. So Wenwen, would you like to?
Yeah, thanks, Dana. And thanks for setting this up. And hi, Graham. Nice to meet you. I'm over here in London, so not too far from you. Thank you for that really interesting talk. This is a big picture question, a little bit unfair to ask, but if you had to identify like 4 or 5 things that would be like the most important behavioral changes that the human race needs to make to preserve biodiversity, what would they be? Is it preserving the rainforests or stopping global warming? Like if just like the most important things that we need to do.
So if we,
Great question.
yeah, no, great question. So at a sort of collective level, the biggest pressure right now is, I think a study that ranked them said the biggest pressure was actually not yet climate change, although with that as the caveat of not yet. Obviously, if we go to 3-4 degrees of warming, that becomes the game changer. So that's kind of the big one on the horizon. At the moment, the biggest driver of biodiversity loss is land use change. So it's really stopping the conversion of existing natural habitats into agriculture in particular, but also cities and so on. So that actually means sort of densifying human impacts. And obviously behavioral changes that help with that are if more people are vegetarian, if people consume foods with lower land use footprints, then that makes it easier to reduce land use change in the big picture. The other one that's having, so obviously climate change second, third, it's actually what gets called overexploitation in general, but that's actually a lot of species are basically being hunted or collected or fished out of existence. And then invasive species as well, and that's a very hard one. So it's just when you're as we're moving around the world, we're transporting species everywhere, and if we, there's one example of like the brown tree snake in Guam kind of ate its way through most of the native species of bird that were found only on Guam. Yeah, so it's kind of an American example.
Thank you.
I see Mohammed, I believe calling in from Nairobi, has his hand up with a question. Would you like to unmute and share your question with Dr. Prescott? Hi.
Hi. First of all, thank you for the amazing talk. We just had the first African climate summit here in Nairobi at the beginning of this month. And biodiversity was a big topic, especially with the biodiversity of Africa. But one thing that was challenging is how do these emerging economies, balance biodiversity and climate change with, taking people out of poverty and improving their economies. So what would you say on that topic?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question. And I think kind of fairness of, who's been able to benefit from the economic opportunities associated with biodiversity loss and who hasn't yet is a big issue. So, I mean, I think I'm trying to remember the name of the paper, but it's basically, and this comes up in sort of donut economics, Kate Raworth, but also in papers on basically sort of safe and just transition. So there's sort of Eric brought up the Earth system boundaries. So there's Earth system boundaries that we shouldn't go above collectively in terms of pollution, biodiversity loss, and so on. But there's also a sort of the optimal amount of going towards those boundaries, not zero. There is a sort of minimum floor that's needed to, there's a minimum floor that, it's not, we can't just say, well, no agriculture. There has to be some agriculture, and we need to make sure that the benefits are shared equally around the world. So it's basically going to look like more consumption from countries that have too little consumption and less consumption from countries that have too much consumption. That's kind of what looks fair and reasonable at a global model. It's obviously a very hard sell. Like, it's a very hard sell in the United States, a very hard sell in Europe to say you need to consume less and other people deserve to consume more. And that can be true, but it's very difficult politically to sell that. So how we sell that politically, I mean, it's hard. And certainly it is, I mean, it is something that it is obviously a big recognized issue that a lot of global north conservationists get wrong in working in emerging economies if they don't recognize that. So I think it's an excellent question. And yeah, one of the really kind of hard, uncomfortable realities we have to deal with to do this justly and effectively.
Eric has raised his hand again. I was going to ask you if you wanted to continue down your list anyway, Eric. I know you have a lot of questions. Would you like to share with us?
I think I'm okay with Bruce going for a second time.
Oh,
first,
Bruce, I didn't see you.
Sorry,
Bruce, go ahead.
he was before me. Yeah.
I was going to start by saying I would like to defer to Eric because he already got in his request with follow-up questions. Eric, I say, take it away.
You're too nice, Bruce. Well, yeah, there's. I don't want to take up too much time because I know you're here, I guess, until the hour. So thank you again. Where? Oh man. Okay. Yeah, I need to recollect myself a little bit. Okay. Maybe one thing that you might not have an answer for, but something I guess all of us are curious about is that is there a way for us to semi-quantify at which point we reach, catastrophic limits in biodiversity? How do we define a potential timeline? At which point does it become, of course, right, you have these planetary boundaries with estimates. Genetic diversity seems to be one of those very challenging ones, but can you provide some of your own personal insight on that?
Yeah, I think it's it's an excellent question. And I think it is one of the challenge areas or unsolved frontier areas of biodiversity. We kind of know, we observe tipping points. And yeah, maybe the ecology jargon for this is a tipping point. So there's a point at which a coral reef is too polluted or too overfished. And so the ecosystem processes that keep it as a coral reef no longer exists, and it switches over to something that's basically dominated by urchins and seagrasses and so on. And and same with there's a potential tipping point at the Amazon, at which point it becomes more of a sort of open grassland ecosystem. I think we tried to predict that through looking at sort of rates of change in a kind of, I think there's some attempts to borrow insights from mathematical modeling of dynamic equilibria in kind of systems, and sort of like engineering systems, but so people do try to do that, but often it's done retrospectively. So it's done retrospectively in terms of, if you look at a system that's tipped over, you can say, oh, this is the point at which it does. You can observe the dynamics, and you can use that to predict when it might go in the future. But still, predictions, those are kind of forecasts based on like fitting models to past observations. It's not really based in fundamental mechanistic modeling. And I don't think we're at a convincing, forward-looking mechanistic modeling yet. Maybe ecologists would disagree. It's not my, so that's not my particular area, but it is a very hard one. And I mean, the cop-out pragmatic answer is we don't know, but it'll be really bad if we do it. So let's try our hardest not to get there.
Not to belabor that point, and then also now recalling the follow-up point that I had originally. Sorry, but if you're establishing a potential quantifiable biodiversity credit, would that also imply, in this case, establishing multiple avenues to adapt to change? Would that also establish that, in theory, you could also potentially calculate thresholds, right, for biodiversity issues? And then also, I guess, could you also, we have as you mentioned, Permian, Triassic extinctions. I guess we can model over that. Of course, that's harder to get data for, but
yeah, no, and I mean, I think, and from those past modeling, that's one where a chart I didn't show, but there was a chart that says basically if you look at basically if we get to 5 degrees, that takes, if you look at absolute change and rate of change, that takes us into past mass extinction territory. So, you know, there is a bit of that. You know, the good news is that, well, you know, at the moment we're on for 2 or 3 degrees change, seems to be the median prediction, I think.
Is that really good news?
I mean, the less bad news. We're not
yeah, less bad.
We're not the less bad news. I mean, it's still past the point beyond which we
It's
would
still
lose.
catastrophic.
Oh, it's still scary. It's still scary. I mean, I'm not underplaying that. I mean, it's still, you know, potentially lose function of the world's coral reefs, which would be a catastrophe. But like the worst, you know, I mean, the fact that the worst models are in play as well is also an issue. But yeah, so I mean, there's a bit of modeling. I'd say none of the crediting systems I'm aware of now are based on thresholds. They're really based on kind of percentage change, either from the starting point or the theoretical maximum. However, the science-based targets philosophy is rooted in some, you know, estimates of, okay, we think this is what we need globally in terms of maximum land use change to conserve biodiversity. And this is the proportional target a company should meet towards that. So the targets, the science-based targets are based on that philosophy, but they are, yeah, I mean, it's that sort of thing of we can run plausible ecological and historically based models to say that, you know, X degrees of warming will have this bad an outcome. We can't find out until we get there, and we don't have multiple experiments to run. So,
sorry, then the follow-up I had initially, and I'll keep further follow-ups to that initial conversation in a separate conversation. But,
yeah, very happy to follow up.
yeah, but on the initial, regarding areas where, say, don't have quote unquote natural ecosystems for hundreds of years, thousands of years, whatever. One of the projects that we're building out, it's not my team, and the agriculture team in the company that I work at, is in restoring degraded lands.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges, of course, is incentivizing stuff like that. If you want to do something like greening the Sahara, where you can potentially build, I guess, additional biodiverse ecosystems, artificial, perhaps. One, is this positive? And then two, if it is positive, are there ways to incentivize this?
I'll start with the second one. So it is possible to incentivize restoration, and a lot of the biodiversity credit.
Even if it's not restoring.
Well, so for instance, in the Plan Vivo, one of the crediting approaches I looked at, Plan Vivo, we'll just look at change in species, increase in species richness above the baseline.
What's Plan Vivo?
Oh, so sorry. It's one, Plan Vivo is one scheme of, it's just one proposal for how biodiversity credits would be generated.
Okay.
That's
Sorry.
one standard setter for, yeah, sorry. So it's, you know, some biodiversity credits will be based on, are you achieving relative to what we think it should be ecologically? Some are just based on, are you increasing number of species and or number of, you know, whatever. So, or, you know, ecological functions or so on. So you could do that. I think there are, I'd say for the different cases. So if it was sort of restore, so I live near Cambridge, so this is an area that used to be kind of temperate swamps, fens, called fens in the UK context, that had lots of bird life, and in the 17th century, Dutch engineers, because they were the best at it, drained it and turned it into some of the most agriculturally productive land in Europe. So, or in England at least. So that's an area where, you know, you could restore that by taking it out of agriculture, turning it back to wetland. And that's a restoration project that would be eligible for credit funding in a lot of cases. Turning the Sahara into forest, I think it would be harder. I think in a lot of credit systems, it would be seen as a kind of unfavorable land use change if it's based on the kind of traditional conservation paradigm of keeping what we think it should be. And it would say, well, you know, it's not as many species, not as many functions, but it is a cool, unique desert ecosystem. A minor link is that a minor consideration that makes us quite, it's interesting. I don't know if this would be, how much of a problem this would be, but actually the soil fertility in the Amazon comes partly from dust blown over from the Sahara. So there are just things of, if we turn the Sahara, if we could magically turn the Sahara into a rainforest, how would that impact the Amazon rainforest? It could be quite difficult to model. But
what an incredible question, Eric. And what I think we could talk about this answer for a long time. I've never been thinking in those terms, but obviously you guys connect. For those of you who don't know, Eric is working at a enterprise which is involved in all kinds of climate and regenerative agriculture related enterprises, developing them. Did I summarize that correctly, Eric?
Yeah, sure.
No.
It's all not about me. But yeah,
I know, but that's why he knows a lot and is able to ask these focused questions to Graham, which I think is interesting for us to hear about. No, it's not about
exactly.
you, but that's others.
So to speak, I guess you could say we're the for-profit version, parallel that Graham is somewhat in.
Yeah, I think we're in a very similar space. We've talked about this, and I think it's also a bit about like a consultancy model versus a venture capital model. But there are a lot of synergies basically. So as we're speaking to a lot of Eric's colleagues, so doing very cool things.
I know Bruce has been waiting patiently to add some more queries to the discussion.
And I'd like to continue with land use management, focus on the United States, and ask a little bit about systems that can help to minimize greenwashing. I was in the Midwest of the United States for much of the summer, where a huge company is Archer Daniels Midland, and they have a great website where they indicate that they now maybe, it requires verification, managing about 2 million acres in regenerative agriculture. But in the United States, my understanding is that the total amount is about 950 million acres, which makes 2 million seem quite small. And the question is, you, I think, address this later in your presentation. What are the chances that we can create uniform standards? You mentioned one example of requiring certain information. Maybe it would be part of the reporting, pledging, and verifying system in order to have your company listed on the stock exchange. Or it could be uniform nationally or globally for ESG activity. Do you see any possibility to ramp that up quickly in the next couple of years?
I think you went mute.
If we can get the, I think if we can get the disclosures, the big disclosure systems, the big kind of voluntary initiatives, right? So with SBTN, there is an assessment system. With TNFD, there will also be, I don't know if it has a, so SBTN, the Science Based Targets Network, has assessors and target validation teams. TNFD, I think, is a bit more grounds up voluntary. I need to look into that. So, but I do think having basically educating, basically putting information out there about how to assess green claims is really important. And regenerative agriculture is actually a great topic because it's a term that means literally nothing at the moment. It can mean anything you want it to mean, because it has no like legal and technical definitions. So it can be defined in a very rigorous scientific way of regenerating ecosystem function, or it can be used to just be, if you say something is organic in the EU, then it has to meet certain standards. If you say it's if you say it's regenerative, it can be whatever you want. So I've seen the claims on a big fast food chain website saying we do regenerative ranching in the Midwest. This is our green policy. It's not really. So it's not a. It's probably quite a negative impact. So I think, yeah, being strict on the listing and so on is important.
I'd like to take you back to a little bit to what you started to talk about in your presentation, to the recent Kunming Montreal Accords and the 30 by 30. How you feel the rollout and the actual compliance we're going to do as a planet, region by region.
It's going to be really difficult. I mean, it's not. I don't know. Actually, I don't know enough about how that's being followed up. It's not a policy space I've spent a lot of time on, so can't really. I can't concretely answer to that. I think they were quite. I mean, the agreement was quite vague on goals, and even for quite well publicized things like 30 by 30 of 30% national protected areas. The meaning of a protected area in the UK is very different from the meaning of a protected area in the US. So these are just not. I mean, the targets don't mean much if I'm honest. I mean, I think the fact that there's global commitment to them is good, but they're a bit too high level to be practically reported on in the moment. That's kind of an initial take. That's maybe that I may need to revise.
I was afraid of different standards for different places, and how can you actually monitor it?
So how can you monitor? So I mean there is a lot of global monitoring of biodiversity, both in land use change from satellite imagery and in repeat species surveys and repeats of the red list assessment to look at species populations and how they're doing. So I mean there is a lot of the scientific community collectively is sort of collecting data that can monitor that. Obviously, you always run into data gaps of the most surveyed areas are North America, Europe, Australia, and the terrestrial surface. So marine biodiversity, invertebrates, bacteria, the tropics. Yeah, so huge data gaps there that we need to fix with systematic monitoring.
I also saw that you have been working in Colombia.
Yes.
And could you tell us a little bit about the work that you did there?
That was on palm oil. So that was on that was on can you expand palm oil sustainably in Colombia? And the answer was yes, if you replace existing cattle ranches instead of rainforest, because cattle ranching is worse for biodiversity than palm oil. And that kind of led, that was a bit of an epiphany for me, because I was like, that was great ecological advice, but it didn't make sense in the Colombian political economy context, where the fact that cattle ranching is the very fact that cattle ranching is economically unproductive and bad for biodiversity makes it very appealing, because it's an easy way to seize control of land, and it's really land value that's important, not like the economic production. So that was sort of a kind of taster into it. But I like, Colombia a lot as a place.
I'm sorry, Sam stepped off in Costa Rica. He's a climate negotiator, and his partner is the chief climate negotiator for Colombia.
Cool.
It would have been nice to have had him engage with you on that, but I think he had to go. I see Wen has her hand up.
I'll take one more question from Wen,
and then
I'll have to go because it's quite late here. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, yes, getting to sneak one more in. Thanks. I was just wondering, like in the wake of the Ukraine war, given that Ukraine and parts of Russia provide like 25% of wheat to the world, have there been any knock-on effects on land use? Like global land use decisions to sort of shift agriculture elsewhere. This question is sort of triggered by the discussion you were having with Eric around agriculture and land use, because I think at the end of the day, ultimately, maybe there needs to be like better global coordination around it.
Yes. So I don't know if that's been studied. I would guess yes. My prediction is yes, it will shift demand. It will make people think, oh, grain prices are going to go up. We don't have a trusted supply here, so we should buy land in areas. We should, buy up lots of land where we can plant wheat or other crops in the future. That's kind of what we saw after whenever there've been sort of food price crunches, maybe after like financial crisis, or when there have been food price spikes, there's been a kind of associated land grabs effectively in other areas. So my prediction is yes, that will have a big impact, and it is quite hard to coordinate on globally, but it is, it's an issue of both. I don't really know enough about how you, like the political economy of how you kind of ensure. I mean, you're even seeing political knock-on effects of, I think, Poland and some Eastern European countries obviously are receiving a lot of cheap Ukrainian grain that in theory is to be imported, but obviously is affecting prices within Poland. So it will be complex dynamics. It may make farming less productive in some places, more productive in others, and it will definitely shift things. I don't know how you actually regulate that at a global level, and how you protect the prices of existing farmers, how you protect communities from land grabbing, how you protect areas. I mean, I think, but yeah, it's hard to. It also brings up an interesting issue in that when you look at a lot of when ecologists get involved in global modeling, they often look at what's like bioclimatically optimal while minimizing biodiversity. And that would be, for instance, maybe let's plant loads in Ukraine, and then as soon as you have a geopolitical crisis, that goes out the window. So, and it's, I mean, it's somewhat modeled in global predictions of biodiversity change and in global climate scenarios. Sometimes they have scenarios with greater economic equilibrium, which kind of implying free trade. Sometimes they don't, so they kind of model it indirectly by saying how much conflict is there between countries and how much, as reflected in how much trade there is between countries. And weirdly, sometimes those models find that when you have more global trade, like if you have total global equilibrium in free trade, you actually have more biodiversity loss because the market efficiently plants agriculture in the areas that are more productive, which are the tropics, which also have the more biodiversity. So it's pretty complex, and I don't know.
Regulation
and difficult geopolitical world we're living in right now. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I am deeply grateful that you took the time all the way from Malaysia. I know you're calling in from Malaysia today. I know we're all have learned a lot, and thank you for allowing us to share this video with our constituents. We will continue to learn and follow, and are so appreciative that you are also a part of our Democrats Abroad family. One thing for sure, these policies will be easier to solve with a Democratic administration in the White House and in Congress and in the Senate. So make sure you register to vote, and thank you for being a part of Democrats Abroad.
Thank you.